The reason is because we now taxpayers are holding, trillions of dollars of this stuff, these toxic investments. And as a result, housing right now is a terrible state of affairs. There are 11 million homeowners that are underwater. They owe more on their mortgages and their houses. That translates to about 50 million people living in houses that are now worth less than what they owe on them, and they're tempted to walk away from them. That's why we don't have any consumer demand. And it's not just the people who are in trouble with their own house, was a tragic enough story, but even if somebody's made every payment, even if they own their own outright, if you foreclose a house or two in that neighborhood, it brings everyone else down. And all this stuff that Obama's been talking about really does not meet the problem. And the basic problem is, instead of throwing money at Wall Street, which is what Bush did and what Obama continued to do, you should have had a moratorium on housing foreclosures. You should have said, okay, Wall Street, we'll help you, but you have now going to be forced through bankruptcy courts, new rules we're going to put in place to adjust people's mortgages so they can stay in their home.
Well, he was an employee for Lehman Brothers, and he was...
This is Governor Kasich.
Governor Kasich, yeah, and he was intimately involved with getting the state of Ohio's pension fund to invest in Lehman Brothers and buy mortgage-backed securities, and of course they lost all that money. And this broadly was really what the mortgage bubble and the financial crisis was all about. It was essentially a gigantic criminal fraud scheme where all the banks were taking mismarked mortgage-backed securities, very, very dangerous, toxic subprime loans. They were chopping them up and then packaging them as AAA-rated investments and then selling them to state pension funds, to insurance companies, to Chinese banks and Dutch banks and Icelandic banks. And, of course, these things were blowing up, and all those funds were going broke. But what they're doing now is they're blaming the people who are collecting these pensions. They're blaming the workers, they're blaming the firemen, they're blaming the policemen, whereas in reality they were actually the victims of this fraud scheme. And the only reason that people aren't angrier about this, I think, is because they don't really understand what happened. If these were car companies that had sold $1 trillion worth of defective cars to the citizens of the United States, there'd be riots right now. But these were mortgage-backed securities. It's complicated. People don't understand it. And they're only now, I think, beginning to realize that they were defrauded.
Why was it not a precondition of their being bailed out that they lend? Why was it not a precondition that they reform mortgages? In other words, so many consumers are still underwater. Their houses worth less than the mortgage. Why not go to the banks and say, you must reduce the face value of mortgages by X%? We're giving you trillions of dollars.
These banks were taking, again, these subprime mortgages, and they would have these billion-dollar pools of mortgages where, in some cases, 70 or 80% of the loans were to people who had no identification or no jobs, or who had put no money down into the mortgage. And then they were taking these loans and applying this phony baloney hocus-pocus math, these derivative instruments, and turning them into AAA-rated investments. And they were marketing, again, these securities to, say, state pension funds as AAA-rated investments, which means credit risk almost zero. So they took this stuff that they knew was very, very risky and very, very likely to default, and they were going to the state of Wisconsin, the state of Ohio, the state of New York, and saying, hey, this is almost as safe as, or in fact it is as safe as the United States Treasury bonds. You should buy this and you'll earn a little bit more than you'll earn if you buy T-bills. The reality was they were just taking absolutely worthless stuff and sticking it with these people, and then fleeing.